All right, welcome back to another episode of the Paycheck to Daycheck Reselling podcast. Today's episode, we're going to talk about something that you hear very often as a reseller, and that is death piles. So we wanted to have this podcast episode be about our death piles hurting your reselling business. So if you are familiar with a death pile, some people call it a money pile, but it's just a pile of inventory that you have sitting around that you haven't listed that needs to be listed. And so we wanted to go in depth and talk about, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? When you have a whole bunch of unlisted inventory, it's not a good thing. For me, when 2020 happened, that was unfortunate. It was a huge disaster. Stores were shutting down. Places where we were going sourcing weren't open anymore. And I think that was eye-opening to Casey and I, because we were in a position where we stopped full-time RVing. We were finally in a house again. We could get more inventory. And when everything shut down, we were in a position where we had no way to find inventory. We didn't expect that to happen. We had no idea that COVID was going to cause everything to shut down. But we were in a situation where we didn't have any inventory at all. We literally had nothing to list. And I think that was really scary. Having a death pile can be a good thing in that situation. The way you could look at it is, what if that were to happen again? And the sources that we were going to, whether it's from something like COVID or just a store in general shutting down, that was kind of our honey hole that we would go to get inventory, and then that place is non-existent anymore. If you think of it that way, I don't think that having a money or a death pile is a bad thing. You never know when you're not going to have inventory.
Yeah, I think obviously we had no idea that was going to happen, like you said, and I think a lot of resellers found themselves in the same position with nowhere to source, nowhere to get stuff. We've been told the responsible thing to do, the quote unquote right thing to do is make sure you have all your stuff listed and keep working on that stuff. And you want to keep adding new and fresh listings all the time and new inventory all the time. But I agree with you. I don't feel it's necessarily a bad thing to have a little bit of a stockpile saved up. I like being prepared just in life in general. And if I have, a couple bins of stuff set aside that isn't listed, it's not something that they're not items that are going to lose their value if I hold on to them for, a couple extra months. And I can kind of work through that and go through those bins, list those items, and sort of replace those items with new items to add to those bins that's unlisted stuff. But if you're doing retail arbitrage, online arbitrage, if you're doing more BOLO stuff, hot items, trending things, that might not work out very well for you, because you need to sell those items while, they're hot and you're going to be able to make the most amount of profit off of them. So I think this would be really good for certain hard goods, antiques, clothing, as long as we're not talking about really hot trending items, classic things that are going to hold their value. Yeah, I think the people that had a little bit of a death pile saved up, a little stockpile, found themselves, with the ability to continue listing fresh and new inventory. So in that sense, like you said, I don't think it was a bad thing. The problem, though, with having a lot of unlisted inventory is that that's just money that you've already spent that's sitting there. It's not doing anything for you. It's just money you've already spent sitting in a pile. So it's not making you more money. It's not, you can't invest that money. It's just sitting there. If you've already spent money on that item, you kind of have to weigh it out. Can I sit on this for a little while? How much did I spend on it? If you spend 50 cents, $1, whatever, it might not make that much of a difference to your financial situation. But if you spend, if you're sourcing larger ticket items, if you spend $50 per item and you have, 50 of them sitting there, that's a lot of money that you just have sitting around. And a lot of people can't function in their business when they have that amount of money tied up. So if it's just sitting there, it can't be sold. If it's not listed, it can't be sold. So yeah, essentially your money is tied up in this unlisted inventory. And for a lot of people, that just won't work.
Yeah. And another way to look at the death pile, it does bring a lot of emotion to people. I know we have our dining room table. once again, covered in inventory. And I don't like that because when I look at it, it makes me kind of anxious. I know I need to list that stuff and it's just sitting there staring at me. So I think that death piles can be bad in the sense where they can bring on emotions such as anxiousness. They can make you frustrated. Then you feel like you're procrastinating because you know you have to do it and you're just pushing it off to the side and you just look at that inventory. It can be very overwhelming for some resellers because if you do get so much inventory that's just sitting there in the death pile, you can get overwhelmed at the idea that you have all of that's unlisted. You know you need to list it. Sometimes it's easier just to go out and buy more inventory. Like that's the fun part. That's what we like about being resellers, is going out and finding those items. But really you have to have that balance. And if it's sitting there and it's bringing you those emotions, then yeah, you're not going to have the motivation to list it. But I think in the end, with having the death pile, you have to get into a good routine. It's there. It's okay that you have a death pile, but you have to remember that you can't just focus on going out and sourcing. You have to focus on listing. And the only way that you're going to reduce the amount of items that you have in your death pile is by listing items.
Yeah, I think if you're keeping a death pile for like a strategic reason, like that's cool. As long as there is a strategy involved in keeping it and you have some kind of like organized chaos. But like you said, if your death pile builds more and more procrastination, if that procrastination to list that inventory leads to more procrastination in other areas of your business, like bad habits build bad habits. They just kind of snowball and they get out of control very quickly. So that's not good. So if you evaluate your business, which you should be doing constantly, evaluate yourself inside of your business, and you find that those habits are stacking up and the procrastination is starting to get a little out of control, you need to like nip that in the bud right away. But yeah, like I said, if it's a strategic sort of like death pile, so you have things set aside just in case like something happens, you're not able to source, maybe your financial situation changes and you're not able to go out and source, maybe your car breaks down or whatever happens and you can't get out to get more inventory, having, some stuff set aside isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as it's not like draining you, your business, your finances, etc.
Yeah, and I think one of the strategies that we have, Casey and I, when we go sourcing and we bring things home, we actually go through those things and kind of prioritize what needs to be listed.
Yes.
We had a bunch of bins that were in our outbuilding when we were going through and organizing, and we found a bin of winter gear, and it was around October. Well, that was the inventory that we knew we needed to list right away. So sometimes look at what you have in your death pile, look at what items you have saved and figure out when's going to be the best time to list them. We have a bunch of t-shirts from a friend. I've mentioned it before. He was getting rid of his eBay store and he wanted us to take everything from a storage unit because he didn't want to have to continue paying for it. So we went and got all this inventory. Well, that was free inventory. So yes, there's a lot of it, but that's kind of the inventory where we put aside and we're saving for a rainy day, just for when we, are low on inventory, because that can happen. So I do think prioritizing what you have that needs to be listed is really important. And then we also need to talk about, is there such thing as having too much inventory? I don't know one single reseller who doesn't have things to list. And maybe you're out there, maybe you're that magical reseller who is so good at sourcing and balancing sourcing and listing, and you don't have anything to list. I just don't think that as a reseller, I've not had something to list. I've always had something in a pile somewhere. If you aren't listing it and the death pile is building up, then that's not good. But if you're finding good inventory, you're listing it consistently, then having too much, I don't think is a bad thing.
All right, guys, that's a wrap on today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Paycheck to Daycheck Reselling podcast.
Anything we mentioned in this episode will be linked down below in the show notes or description down below.
Be sure to share this episode with anyone you think it will help and follow us on social media at P2D Podcast.
Thanks again for listening. Keep working towards that Daycheck.